The concept of an MVP, or most valuable player, is one that's really interesting. Ultimately, any time that you're playing a game that involves multiple players, be that sports, quizzes, or video games like Fire Emblem, every player has something that they're bringing to the table. But ultimately you're going to think one of these roles is more important than others. In Fire Emblem, your main healer might be the only reason you are able to stay alive each map, but if you don't have a boss killer, then you're never going to clear the map and eventually you'll run out of heals. Fire Emblem as a series loves to tell you how you did and reward you for good gameplay. Fire Emblems 4 to 7 gave you ranks at the end of your playthrough based on things like turn count, experience, available funds, and unit deaths. The games also give you information on how many battles, wins, and sometimes losses your units gained as well. Some games even rank your units based on how often they were used or how good they were. The game will also give you summaries for each map, including time taken to beat the map, turn count, and in some games the MVP of each map as well. I love seeing all of these figures at the end of every playthrough, but I do often wonder how accurate they are when looking for what your best unit actually was. Hi, I'm Severus Gudra, and today I want to use science to figure out how you can calculate the best unit in your Fire Emblem playthrough. I fell down this rabbit hole while I was writing the script for my most recent video of an all reclassing run of Engage, so this is what I'll use as the basis for my calculations. Just keep that in mind as every game works slightly differently, and what counts as a good unit in one Fire Emblem game might be useless in another. So, I actually really love numbers. I worked as a maths tutor for some extra cash at university, and I have 2 science degrees. One thing I learned at uni that I don't think gets talked about enough is how easily stats can be manipulated by factors both in and out of your control, and just how much thought and consideration is often put into how to analyse data. Things like sample size, variation in responses, how many options you give, and how you actually word your questions can all have a massive impact on your results. These considerations can already be quite challenging when you're setting out your own experiment, but it's even harder to account for when you're playing a video game which ultimately was never intended to be analysed in a controlled and scientific way. It just means that a lot of information that we have available to us needs to be looked at with a more critical eye. But let's have a look at that information first. The biggest pieces of information that Fire Emblem gives us about how good a unit is are their stats, battles and wins, and who the MVP was for each map. Let's start with MVP. Some Fire Emblem games, especially the later ones in the series, will explicitly tell you who they think was your MVP for each map. You might also get a summary of these at the end of the game alongside turn count. The thing is, how your MVP is calculated might vary game to game and isn't really explained. People have suggested online that things like damage dealt, kills, and how many battles a unit was in might all contribute, but this information is actually quite hard to find, and when I looked it up there didn't seem to be anything solid on how MVP was calculated in each game. My guess would be that it swings more to how often a unit was in battles. This would explain why on my current run of 3 houses, which is a Marianne and Hilda solo run, Balthus managed to get MVP for his paralogue, because even though Hilda and Marianne were dealing the most damage and killing the most enemies, all of the enemies were gunning for Balthus and Happy, so they probably had more battles overall. So MVP might not be the best estimate of who the best contributor was to each map, but even if it was, you're still limited by the fact that you only get 1 MVP per map. So maybe you can count up how many times someone got MVP overall, but there's no way of knowing who was second best in each map, or who the least valuable player was in each map. MVP is also heavily biased by unit availability. This is a concept that's going to come up a lot in this video because it plays a huge role in how good your units look. Availability, or how early into the game you can get a character, is often something that's factored into people's evaluations of Fire Emblem units because of how important it is. A unit that's available from the very start has a lot more room to grow and potentially fix problem areas. They're also less likely to be competing for a spot in your army because by the time more units come round in the late game, your early units are at their level or better, and you're more attached to them as well. This is especially true in early Fire Emblem, where your army size was massive and many later game units were intended to be replacements for statistically better early game units who may have died. But there are some exceptions to this, such as forced deployments and endgame units. For example, Athos joins in the final chapter of FE7 and you're definitely going to want him there. Equally, games like Engage set you up to have Vale and Mauvier on your team by expanding your deployment limits on their joined chapters and leaving them at that size for the rest of the game. So there isn't much cost of putting them on your army, especially if it's your first playthrough and you weren't expecting to have 2 extra slots. As much as availability makes sense as a measure for evaluating a unit's overall worth in any run, it can be a bit of a hindrance when you want to evaluate a specific playthrough because every unit in your army was chosen by you. Late joining units may be completely run defining, but they just don't have as many opportunities to demonstrate that as your early game units, so deciding who your best unit is by how many times they got MVP will most likely favour early units against later units. This is also a problem for your wins, battles and losses, which is probably the best piece of information we have to go off of when it comes to figuring out who your best unit was. Fire Emblem games almost always tell you how many battles your unit fought and how many of those battles they won by defeating their opponent. Some games also include losses, which is how many times a unit dies, including when you reset the game to try a map again because they died. This looks like a pretty good metric at face value. Units with the most battles and wins are the ones that are the most useful, but it falls apart even with just a little bit of scrutiny. If you look at my reclass run, Aaliyah had more than twice as many battles and wins as Rosado, which would suggest that Rosado wasn't a solid contributor. But Aaliyah was the first unit to join the army and Rosado was the last, joining after 16 chapters, about 6 paralogs and 6 divine paralogs. Aaliyah is also force deployed in every chapter, whereas I had to decide whether or not I wanted Rosado to be deployed in chapters, as most of them had a deployment limit of less than 14. That's at minimum 28 more chapters worth of battle experience for Aaliyah, and that doesn't even take into account the fact that Fire Emblem units do other things than just battling. My Aaliyah was a bow knight who, apart from using goddess dance once or twice per map, had the sole purpose of fighting and killing enemies. Rosado, on the other hand, was a griffin knight with the Camilla emblem, so a part of his role was to use his turns to heal units and set dragon veins, ultimately giving him less opportunities to fight enemies. All of this was also true for Hortensia, who had the fewest battles and kills out of everyone, but was also the primary staffer of the army and joined later than most units. So if battles and wins are impacted by availability, how can we fix that? I thought of 2 ways. The first one was the simplest, and this is what I normally do at the end of a Fire Emblem playthrough to gauge unit effectiveness. You just divide the number of wins by the number of battles to get a percentage of how many battles resulted in victory. Doing this essentially shows how good your units are at killing the enemies that they fight. Another thing you can do is look at a unit's overall availability and see how much they were contributing per map. There are 42 chapters and paralogs in base game Engage, plus 6 divine paralogs and 6 chapters of the Fel Xenologue for DLC players, so all you have to do is see when your unit joined and thus how many chapters they had available to be deployed on. You can find this information during the credits as they show each map in the order that you played them, or you can just estimate them. Once you have an estimate of how many chapters each unit had available, you just divide that number by the number of battles and wins to get an average battle and win count per chapter. Running these calculations ended up benefiting later joining units like Rosado and Merrin, who didn't have as much chance to contribute, but were pretty good units, as well as highlighting how some early joining units like Alfred, Fram and Boucheron look like consistent contributors, but were actually not pulling their weight as much. Some units like Aaliyah, Yunaka and Binay were pretty much unchanged, but that's just because Aaliyah and Yunaka were just really good overall, and Binay was just really bad. For that reason, I like these better than just the raw numbers of battles and wins, but they're still not perfect. For one, they all prioritise combat utility over everything else when we know that subunits are made for support. For example, I didn't put Seedle into this table because I didn't reclass him, and these rankings are for an all reclassing run. But if I had, then he would be consistently coming out on the bottom of the pile because he's not really supposed to be in battles. And this was reflected in his results. 31 battles, 18 kills, 58% ratio of wins to battles, and about 1 battle and a half a kill per map. For all intents and purposes, these stats make Seedle look like the worst unit in the army by a long shot, but he wasn't the worst unit. That honour goes to Binay. Sorry, Binay, you were just terrible. Hortensia also comes out of these calculations looking terrible, and I did rank her very low on my video, but that wasn't due to her combat, it was because Martial Master is a bad choice for her compared to Sleipnir Rider. Stats that measure a unit based on kills also completely screw over units whose primary purpose is debuffing or chip damage. Not every unit who does damage is doing so in order to kill their opponent. Sometimes players will have units take a small chunk of damage off an opponent so that another unit can come in and land the kill. Or that might happen in reverse if you're using a stronger unit to train up a scrawny trainee. Other builds, and even some classes, are made to specifically lower an enemy's stats or poison them for easier damage. The Mage Cannoneer is a great example of this. A lot of the weapons that this class uses are specifically made to freeze, break, silence or poison enemy units. They're not supposed to be killing blows. Some players also augment this further with the Corrin Ring for Draconic Hex and Dreadful Aura debuffs. Whenever I have Mage Cannoneer on my army, their win to battle ratio is atrocious because killing is not their job. These stats can also potentially look bad for units with long training arcs, and it can also be influenced by a player's own favouritism for who they want to feed kills and experience to. So even though running these calcs might give you a better idea of who is pulling their weight, it's still not perfect. Another thing the game gives us is stats. Every unit's stat spread is going to look different, and you can get a bit of a feel for how useful a unit is both in their role and overall by looking at relevant stats. Every unit also has a rating that is made up of all their key stats added together apart from HP. There are some questions about how you measure stat rating in a game like Engage, because there are external factors like emblem or bond rings, heavy weapons, inheritable skills, and stat boosting items which can all impact your stat totals. Most of these are really easy to unequip and eliminate, or are just considered part of the overall build. But stat boosters are particularly contentious because with favoritism and a boatload of boosters, any unit can look like they had good level ups, and there's no record of who got what, you just have to keep track yourself. For the purposes of what I wanted to do, I felt like all of these external factors were just part of my unit's builds, so I didn't worry about them. I took my unit's totals based on how they looked with that unit's main weapon equipped. The only exception I made for this was unequipping Boucheron's weapon because it was ludicrously heavy. Even with a build stat of 25, it took 14 points off his speed. I felt like unequipping this was fair enough since he wasn't exclusively using that weapon and literally nothing else weighed him down. The overall stat rating can help you get a feel for how unit stats are in general, but it is ultimately too ambiguous to draw any firm conclusions from it about what units are good and bad. Obviously a unit with a rating of 200 is likely to be better than one with a rating of 100, but not every stat is created equal and different units want different stats to be higher. Let's take Citrine as an example. Citrine has a stat rating of 191, putting her at 5th place out of the army, which is pretty good. But if we look at her specific stats in more depth, what we find is that she has crazy high magic resistance and luck, and literally every other stat is at the bottom of the barrel. This is fine, because Citrine's job was to heal her allies, deal magical damage, and tank hits from mages. You don't need anything else for that. But Citrine's high stat rating suggests at face value that she's either good or decent in most areas, where in reality she was absolutely terrible at taking physical hits, doubling, or doing damage with arts which rely on strength and magic. And there's nothing wrong with having a niche, especially when you know what it is, but ultimately stat rating doesn't show any of those niches. There are a couple of other problems with stat rating. The fact that it doesn't take HP into account being a big one, since HP ultimately is quite an important stat. It's not a deal breaker if you don't have it. Yunaka had the 3rd worst HP and she was one of the best units in the army, but it's not nothing either. The other problem is that a unit's stats aren't always important for their role, or gaps can be patched up with other things. Let's look at Etier, who had the worst stat rating of everyone and didn't have any individual standout stats either. Her stats don't paint the picture of a good unit, but half of Etier's time was spent creating fog with Corrin so other units could stay out of harm, and other times she was being used to poison enemies and make them easier for your units to kill. She also had a forged and engraved dagger to patch up her low dex, as well as the brute force skills from Crom so that when she crit she was still killing even with her low strength stat. Stat rating is cool and you do generally see that units with higher ratings perform better, but it isn't the be all and end all. The game does obviously let you see your unit's individual stat spreads as well, so you can compare these individually, but it gets a bit harder to compare when you're trying to figure out who the best unit is because all of your units need different stats. Yunaka had a really bad defense stat, but she didn't need to be physically bulky because she wasn't supposed to be tanking hits. She was supposed to be crit killing things on her first attack and dodging anything coming her way. I suppose you could split your units up into subgroups and rank them there, but even then units with the same role can get the same results in different ways. And how would you figure out whether your best magic unit was better than your best physical unit? What about mixed attackers like mage knights? It's just too convoluted. It is fun to look at though if you like unit comparisons. So that's everything the game gives us to go on, but we are missing a very crucial perspective of our own. Regardless of how many battles or wins a unit has or how high their stats are, sometimes a unit just feels bad. Equally, builds that you're really proud of or that you really enjoyed can look bad on paper. The way that you rank your own units is ultimately up to you, but if you're finding it hard then adding some numbers into the equation can help figure out how you feel. For my army, I came up with ratings based on 4 different categories. How much fun I had with them, power and utility, which includes both support and combat focus units, how much I liked the build I created, and since it was a reclassing run, how much I liked the build compared to the unit's base class. I then just added all 4 scores together and divided them by 4 to get an average rating. This was pretty good because it pulled together all of the things I found important into one rating, but you can also change this up pretty easily and swap out categories based on whatever run you're doing. If you're doing this, I recommend a small scale of 1 to 5 because you're less likely to skew your ratings with high scores in one category. You can add half and quarter points if you like, or if all your ratings are coming out very samey, because they will add some variation without distorting averages too much. So now we have all of the data we can come up with for our units, and this was ultimately what I used to make and adjust my rankings when I was writing my last video. The combat stats, stat rating, individual stats, and my own personal rating worked quite well together to help me understand not only how I felt about the units, but also what their performance looked like on a relatively objective level. This allowed me to be more realistic about some rankings like Chloe, who I really didn't enjoy but ultimately wasn't giving enough credit to for being a strong contributor. Even though I was happy with the system, I still wanted to see how far I could push the analysis to get a more accurate understanding of unit performance. What I decided to do was collapse all of these statistics into one figure, well, technically 2, but I'll get onto that in a minute, and I wanted to see how that compared to my personal rankings. I started by ranking my units on each measure, so the unit with the most battles got 1, the unit with the least got 13, and so on with each measure. If there were ever any units who had the exact same number for any measure, what you typically do is give them joint place, and then skip whatever number came next. So for example, Aaliyah and Yunaka had the exact same number of battles per chapter, so they were given a joint 2nd place, and then the unit after that, Rosado, got 4th place, and there was no 3rd place given. Once I had all of my rankings written out, I took an average of these to see which units were consistently coming out on top. The only problem I had with this was that it was still including battle and win numbers that are massively stacked against late joiners. So I did the same average calculation as before, but excluding the ranks for those 2 measures to get an adjusted average ranking. I then compared this to my rankings to see what discrepancies there were. The original average ranking still did okay, but as you can probably imagine, the adjusted ranking resulted in fewer egregious discrepancies, as well as one more perfect match. There was only one unit who had a bigger discrepancy with my rank after adjusting the average, and that was Etier. Every other unit's discrepancy was either the same or better after excluding raw wins and battles. The only really bad outlier I had in the end was Fram, who I put 7 places higher than what my calculations suggested. That's honestly just because I really enjoyed this build, even though I knew it maybe wasn't the best on paper, and my video was specifically about how much I would recommend that you try each build, not how game breaking they are. More for fun than anything else, I also counted up how often each of my units appeared in either the top or bottom 3 for every performance measure or stat, as well as how often they appeared on either podium overall, and a different score to see who had more top placements than bottom. This didn't really reveal anything, it was just fun, though I did feel bad for Etier being the only unit to never place in the top 3. I mean, even Seedal made the podium once, and he was only included in the individual stat rankings. The very last thing I thought to look at was audience opinion. I'm self-admittedly not the best at unit building or playing Fire Emblem on the harder difficulties, so I wanted to see what the community thought of my build and how similar those rankings were to what I had. But like any time you're asking people to share an opinion for science, there are some factors you need to consider. The first being that if your participants are answering the questions in the way that you're supposed to. Danny Doyle often talks about this in her videos that involve community tier lists. You can put instructions for a poll in the description, but ultimately some people just don't read them, they miss an instruction, or don't know the context for the question. Some people also don't have an informed opinion, but still want to be part of the conversation. My boyfriend has never played all the way through Engage, and when I asked him if he was voting on my polls and how, he said that he was essentially just guessing each time because he wanted to see what other people had said, and YouTube just doesn't have a see results option. If you want to see the result, you have to vote. You could also have people who are just voting their favourite units higher, or who are rating the unit themselves instead of the actual build. I tried to prevent this with my wording and by putting the instructions first, and I do think most people are engaging with it genuinely, but ultimately you never know. I have seen some brilliant summaries in the comments though, so thank you if you commented something. The other thing to consider is how you translate public opinions into numbers, and how you capture those without having scores clustering in the middle and becoming homogeneous. The scales that you choose have meaning, and you need to choose the right values for the results that you're looking for. People can sometimes tend away from extremes with things that are relatively subjective and low importance, so with a limit of 4 options I need to be careful not to word the high and low options to be too extreme and polarising. Equally, the polls are coming out one day at a time, so there's no guarantee that you'll get the same number of results each time. What I decided was to have 2 positive options and 2 negatives, either giving or taking 1 or 2 points, and to make that really clear on the poll. To control for variation in number of responses, I used percentage of responses as opposed to the specific number of people voting for each option. To get an audience score, I multiplied the percentage of votes for each option by its associated point number, and then I added those 4 numbers together. I don't actually have all the results since the polls are still coming out as I record this, so I'll let Editing Gudra put the results in here. Hi, it's Editing Me. I wanted to start by looking at the number of votes that every poll got, just to make sure that there were no polls that were getting maybe 20 votes while others were getting 200, because that would have been really hard to compare between the two. The poll that got the least votes was the poll for Fram, which got 135 votes, and Aaliyah's poll got the most with 187. This is a difference that I'm relatively happy to accept for the purposes of what this is. Ultimately, it's just a YouTube poll, and it's really hard to get consistent voting on all of them. I calculated the scores and I ranked them from largest to smallest, and what we can see is that Yunaka had the highest score of 145, closely followed by Citrine with 143. We then had Merin in 3rd place once again with 126, closely followed by Rosado with 123. After that we had Fram, then Aaliyah, Jean, Chloe, Etier and Boucheron at 10th place, and then Alfred in 13th place with 34 points, Bunet in 12th with 2 points, and Hortensia way down at the bottom with minus 73 points overall, making her the only unit with a negative score, meaning that more people were voting her as a bad build than as a decent or a good build. This is probably just because I was keeping her in the same role that she normally fulfills of being a healer and a staffer, but I took her out of a class that enables her to be such an amazing healer and staffer in the first place. It took away her access to magic tomes, which allows her to defend herself in a pinch, as well as her class ability, which conserves the use of staves. It also took away higher mobility that she could use to get around the map easier and do a better job of reaching units to heal them. We can also look at the distribution of scores themselves for each individual poll. Each poll had 4 options for audiences to vote on: either it's good, which gave 2 points, it's decent, which gave 1 point, it needs work, which gives a negative point, or it's bad, which takes away 2 points. The units with the most +2 and -2 votes were the ones that were at the top and the bottom of the leaderboard respectively, which makes a lot of sense. And similar is true for the units who were getting the highest proportion of votes saying it needed work. What was slightly more interesting was the amount of people who voted different builds as being decent and giving 1 point, and this was definitely the most common vote in the majority of the polls, with only Yunaka, Citrine, Merrin, Rosada and Hortensia getting a higher proportion of votes in other options than it's decent. This might just be because quite a lot of modern Fire Emblem games allow units to be quite robust to changes so that you can still beat the game with your favourite unit. It might also just be that my unit building was relatively good and understood what the characters needed, even if the choices weren't necessarily amazing themselves or the units didn't turn out absolutely amazing contributors due to other factors. What was quite interesting to me was that Aaliyah got the highest proportion of votes saying it was decent, being way higher than most other units at 68%, and this tracks out really well with the fact that they ended up in the middle of the leaderboard more or less at 6th place. We can also compare my rankings with the scores that were given by the audience, and I've ranked these and I've called this audience rank on the table, but I do want to give a slight clarification there. The polls that I sent out to the audience were not actually asking them to rank each unit, because that involves comparison to each build and deciding which one is the best and which one is the worst and everything in between. This was not what I did with my polls. I showed my audience each build individually and asked them to give their thoughts on each one individually, not making comparisons to other builds, just how they thought about each one on its own. This was ultimately the best way that I could have done it, because it would have been really hard to do it any other way and still be easy to analyse, but you should take it with a pinch of salt. When I call this the audience ranking, it's actually the ranked scores that were given by the audience, which is slightly different. If we compare the differences between the two, there are a few that had a perfect match between my rankings and the ranked audience scores, and these were Binet, Merrin and Yunaka. The rankings for Boucheron, Chloe and Jean were also very similar as well, and the scores for Alfred, Aaliyah, Fram and Hortensia were also only a few points out either side as well. What's slightly more interesting to me were the units who had a relatively higher different score compared to my rank, which was Citrine, Etier and Rosado. Etier was the only one of these 3 that was ranked higher by myself than the audience score would suggest, and this is probably just because I had a lot of fun with that build and ultimately that came into my rankings quite a lot. Equally, fun is something that is relatively subjective. My definition of fun could be slightly different to my audience's definition of fun as well, or it's possible that the audience was basing their opinions more off of utility and unit building itself than how much fun they would have with that build. The other 2 units, Citrine and Rosado, I ranked as lower than the audience scores would suggest. Citrine was ranked in 2nd place with the audience scores, where I put her in 7th place, and this might just be because Citrine's build was a pretty good one, and Citrine is also a pretty good unit as well. She's a bit of a magical powerhouse, and it was a build that stayed very true to Citrine's roots without stripping away a lot of really important things like I did with Hortensia's build. And I didn't really have any problems with this build myself, it just wasn't as fun as some of the other builds that I had, which is why I put it lower down than the audience scores would suggest. The other one of these was Rosado, and I was actually really happy to see that the audience was ranking it really high in comparison to my ranking of 8th place. I mentioned before that I really like Rosado, and it's really nice to see that people were really responding well to a build that allowed him to play it in a slightly different way. What I think probably the biggest reason is for this disparity in audience score and my rank is probably because I was comparing Rosado to the other units in my army, whereas the people voting on the poll were just voting on the Rosado build in isolation. And it is a build that I am really proud of, apart from not being able to read and putting Asgard on and thinking it did a completely different thing to what it actually does, but ultimately it was a build that I really enjoyed. It just ultimately wasn't as much of a contributor as other units in my army, which is why I put him lower down. It's nice to see Rosado come out relatively near the top, even if I didn't put him near the top in my own rankings. So that's pretty much every way I can think of to evaluate a Fire Emblem unit's performance. I actually did an online course on Microsoft Excel in my last job, and being able to do these stats more easily has genuinely been the biggest benefit I've had from that training. Let's not think about that too hard. Ultimately, I don't think you're ever going to find a perfect metric to evaluate an army's performance because of how much goes into making a good Fire Emblem unit, and how many perspectives there are on what counts as a good unit in the first place. And I think that's a good thing. Fire Emblem is ultimately a game that you're supposed to play with a full army, who all have their own part to play and their own personal stake in whatever was happening on the map. If the game had a more clear-cut way of defining who was the best and who was the worst, it would be so much easier to make your units compete rather than remembering that they're supposed to be a team. Now that does raise a question of why I've been spending so much time crunching numbers to find out who's the best unit, when I think it's a good thing that the game doesn't do that for you. But honestly, that makes perfect sense to me. The game doesn't have an objectively accurate way of telling you who your best units were, so we all have to draw our own conclusions and use our own methods. Mine involve numbers because I really like numbers. They help me to make sense of my own opinions, other people's opinions, and also why those two things might differ. I also just love deep dives in very specific parts of my interests. Two of my favourite videos I've seen since discovering Fire Emblem YouTube have been Danny Doyle's video on what constitutes a Christmas Cavalier, and Actual Lizard's video on what makes a good Fire Emblem unit, so I wanted to add my own needlessly thorough analysis into the mix. And if you like things like this too, then consider subscribing. I'll be putting out new videos every second Sunday, or at least trying to, because I'm going home over Christmas and my laptop is on life support, so we'll see how that pans out. But let me know in the comments how you normally decide who your best units were in a Fire Emblem playthrough. Until next time, take care.